Guten Abend, liebe Beiratsmitglieder, liebe Fellows, liebe Freunde des Hauses. Zweimal im Jahr, am Vorabend zur Beiratssitzung, stehe ich hier und singe ein Loblied auf den Beirat. Das wird natürlich für die Habitués ein bisschen langweilig, aber das ändert nichts an der Wahrheit. An der Wahrheit, dass wir ohne den Beirat unsere Arbeit hier gar nicht leisten könnten. Es gibt keine Fellow-Kandidatur, die nicht durch den Beirat ginge, und das setzt für jedes einzelne Mitglied des Beirats ausgedehnte Lektüre und zahlreiche Stellungnahmen voraus. Das ist einfach ganz schlicht eine erkleckliche Menge Arbeit, für die ich immer wieder nur danken kann. Der Vortrag am Vorabend ist in diesem Sinne nicht zuletzt ein kleines Dankeschön an die Beiratsmitglieder. Und heute Abend besteht das Paradoxon darin, dass unser Referent Sebastian Conrad selbst seit 5 Jahren Mitglied des Beirats ist und zudem Historiker. Und Historiker bzw. Historikerinnen sind unter den Kandidaten besonders häufig vertreten. Das heißt, er hat einen überdurchschnittlichen Anteil der Arbeit, die im Beirat zu leisten ist. Und nun als Dank für diese Arbeit frage ich ihn, ob er uns heute Abend einen Vortrag hält, um sich selbst mit zu danken, und freundlicherweise hat er Ja gesagt. Dafür hätte ich nun wiederum zu danken, was leicht zu einem unendlichen Regress führen könnte. Ich lasse es damit bewenden und stelle ihn einfach kurz vor. Sebastian Conrad studierte in Bonn, in Osaka und in Berlin Geschichte, Japanologie und Ökonomie. Eine, würde ich denken, ungewöhnliche Kombination. Ich weiß nicht, wie groß die Schnittmenge der 3 Fächer sonst ist. Er schreibt 1994 eine Magisterarbeit hier an der FU über einen Vergleich der Universitäten in Japan und in Deutschland Ende 19. und frühes 20. Jahrhundert. Und schon diese Arbeit scheint mir interessant zu sein. Interessant zu sein für einen komparatistischen Ansatz. Vergleichen kann man nur Dinge, die unterschiedlich sind, die aber nicht so unterschiedlich sind und vor allem, die man selber jede für sich schon untersucht hat. Da geht also ein Student nach Japan und studiert in Deutschland und schreibt dann einen Vergleich über die Universitäten, die er als Studierender kennengelernt hat. Das ist eine Kombination aus Immersion und Distanz, von der ich eigentlich denken würde, dass sie für seine Arbeit überhaupt emblematisch ist. Die Promotion ähnlich, also ganz anderes Thema, aber nach einem ähnlichen Strickmuster. Da ging es um die Art, wie Historiker in Japan und in Deutschland auf den Zweiten Weltkrieg und die Zeit davor reagiert hatten. Also Geschichtsschreibung in Japan und in Deutschland 1945 bis 1960. Ein Historiker schreibt also über die eigene Zunft und gleichzeitig aber in dieser vergleichenden Perspektiven. Früh krümmt sich, was ein Häkchen wird, pflegte meine Großmutter, die in Königsberg geboren war, zu sagen. Und auf Sebastian Conrad scheint dieses Diktum besonders gut zu passen. Aus dem Historiker, der Japan und Deutschland vergleichend in den Blick nahm, ist ein profilierter Vertreter der sogenannten Globalgeschichte geworden. Unter dem Etikett Globalgeschichte kann man, und das ist bei Sebastian Conrad in verschiedenen Publikationen nachzulesen, vieles und Unterschiedliches verstehen. Auf jeden Fall bedeutet die Globalgeschichte eine Abkehr von der herkömmlichen Enge von Nationalgeschichten, eine Abkehr, die im Horizont transnationaler Globalisierungsprozesse ebenso plausibel wie zwingend erscheint. Mir hat diese postnationale Trendwende schon deshalb immer eingeleuchtet, als ich vom Fach her nicht postnational, sondern pränational veranlagt bin. Nationalstaaten sucht man in der antiken Mittelmeerwelt bekanntlich umsonst. Um die Arbeitsweise von Sebastian Conrad zu skizzieren, möchte ich heute Abend nur eine einzige Publikation anschauen. Und das ist ein Aufsatz über das Phänomen der Aufklärung in globalhistorischer Perspektive. Der Aufsatz, ein großer Aufsatz, ist vor 5 Jahren in der American Historical Review erschienen. Darin wendet sich der Autor gegen den Gemeinplatz, die Aufklärung als ein Distinktivmerkmal Europas zu betrachten und sie in Europa aus rein endogenen Wurzeln abzuleiten. Seine Argumentation in dem Aufsatz hat eine doppelte Stoßrichtung. Erstens kann er zeigen, dass zahlreiche Diskurse des 18. Jahrhunderts, die wir als typisch aufklärerisch empfinden, keineswegs das Produkt einer europäischen Nabelschau sind, sondern lebendige Erfahrungen mit außereuropäischen Kulturen verarbeiten, ob die Impulse nun aus Asien, Afrika oder Südamerika kommen. Das aufklärerische Europa, stellt man nach Lektüre des Aufsatzes fest, das aufklärerische Europa ist alles andere als ein abgeschlossener Kontinent gewesen. Zweitens, die Aufklärung hat sich seit dem späten 18. Jahrhundert über den ganzen Globus ausgebreitet, aber dieses Phänomen ist nicht wie die Ausbreitung eines Virus zu verstehen, der im Verlauf des Ausbreitungsprozesses einigermaßen konstant bleibt. Die Ausbreitung der Aufklärung verdankt sich dem Umstand, dass ihre Parolen zu unterschiedlichen Zeiten und an unterschiedlichen Orten aufgegriffen, den lokalen Bedingungen angepasst bzw. neu erfunden wurden. Und dasselbe gilt selbst für den Begriff der Aufklärung. Zitat: Enlightenment was not a thing. Rather we should ask what historical actors did with it, with the concept, did with it. Enlightenment should not be confused with an analytical category. It was primarily a concept to formulate and legitimize particular claims. Zitat Ende. Und das gilt nicht nur für Haiti oder Mysore im späten 18., für Korea und Japan im späten 19. Jahrhundert. Es gilt, wie mir scheint, auch für einen Großteil der europäischen Historiographie des 19. und 20. Jahrhunderts, die aus der Aufklärung just das, ein Ding, eine Sache gemacht haben, und zwar eine ausschließlich europäische. Dass damit auch in Europa, genauso wie in anderen Teilen der Welt, ganz bestimmte politische Ansprüche legitimiert werden sollten, versteht sich von selbst. Sebastian Conrad hat sich schon mit vielerlei Themen beschäftigt, mit Architekturgeschichte indessen, soweit ich sehe, noch nie. Insofern ist der heutige Abend eine Premiere. Von der Rezeption der Aufklärung zu einer Geschichte des Klassizismus mag es indessen nur ein kleiner Schritt sein. Lieber Sebastian Conrad, wir freuen uns auf den Vortrag.
All right, thank you so much for the. Ich spreche jetzt einfach auf Englisch gleich. There are some at least among us who don't speak German, so let's switch to English. Thanks a lot for your introduction. It was actually, I think, when was it? A long time ago when I gave my last lecture here. I was a fellow at the time, and I was a fellow together with Luca Giuliani. So if you're a fellow today, look around you. One of you may be the next rector in a couple of years. Well, when he asked me to give this talk, I knew it was going to be his last year in tenure here at the Wissenschaftskolleg, and I needed to make sort of a move towards Luca Giuliani, so I thought I'd throw a little bit of Greece and antiquity into this talk. Let's see to what extent that works out. And you're right. It is something that is new, that I'm testing in a way, and so I also don't know exactly how long this is going to take. So if somebody maybe after 2 hours or so would remind me that I should stop, I would appreciate that. Right. So let's start. We'll encounter 2 persons. One of them is Ito Chuta from Japan, who in 1902 decided to leave the country, traveled to China, traveled to India, Burma, Sri Lanka, the Ottoman Empire. He was away for 3 years. And in these various parts of the world, and this is from his notes, he has all kinds of, and lots of drawings that he drew. He was lonely, essentially, 3 years long. I mean, it was travel through countries whose language he didn't know. He was short of money every once in a while. It was hot or it was too cold. He was away from his family. He left his friends. He left his wife. He left even his young daughter, who he never met before he came back. And she was already 3 years old. Why all this hardship? Why all that? Well, because he was out there to prove that this temple in Nara was not only as beautiful as Greek temples, and not only similar to Greek temples, but that this temple was actually literally influenced by ancient Greece. Now, his contemporary, or almost, is this person, Rajendra Lal Mitra from Calcutta in Bengal. Now, his life is entirely different. He never left the country. He stayed at home. He essentially stayed in his local Bengal in Orissa. And while he was also obsessed with the question of origins, where did Indian architecture come from, he did everything he could, and that meant travel to the remotest sites, excavating architectural remains, publishing voluminous tomes on architectural history. He did everything he could in his professional life to prove that Indian architecture was not influenced by Greek architecture in any way. Now, this is the puzzle in some ways that I want to address and I want to talk about, right? How can we explain and come to terms with these trajectories and biographies? So these are the questions that I want to ask. Both of these actors are interested in how to measure. They're both interested in bringing sort of their own architecture onto or into world architecture. And they do this by referring to a standard, a global standard. They both believe in the existence of a global standard. Now, historians in recent years, global historians in particular, are very interested in this emergence of standards. And they look at all kinds of things like the emergence of the meter, the metric system, the weights and measures and all that. They're looking at something more less tangible, say, namely the emergence of time as a global standard, or international law, and so forth and so forth. But in this particular field of culture that seems so unique in particular, so incompatible, so difficult to translate, we don't, there's not much work on this subject. And so my question will be, how can we observe and analyze the emergence of global standards in this field that seems so resistant to any kind of generalization or abstraction, right? So this is the main question I'm going to ask. And I'll secondly ask more specifically, how can we look at this beyond what historians usually do in these cases? Namely, they say, oh yeah, this is a European standard, and then it diffused. It was spread because it's so appealing and attractive, or it spread because it came with the power of arms and colonialism. These are the typical explanations of this kind of process. And I want to try to move beyond that, and let's see to what extent you'll follow me. And I'm sure the discussion will be on that to some extent. So in some ways, you could say that I'll be talking about this famous, because both of these actors that I'll be talking about they will reference Greece as this potential standard, ancient Greece, and in some ways they do this in similar, but in some ways in also very radically different ways. So you could say that what I'll be talking about is reflections on this famous Goethe quote that everybody should be Greek in his own way, but he should be Greek. In other words, we'll be talking about the global reach of this trope, and at the same time, about the local specificity of the way in which it's used and applied. All right, so let's briefly meet the two protagonists for a little longer, if you bear with me. So let's start with Ito Chuta, who is a famous Japanese historian of architecture and an architect in his own right. He was one of the first, second generation of architects in Japan. Went to Tokyo University, which is was at that time a very recent institution, where he This is what it looked like back then. And he studied architecture. As so many subjects in Japanese universities at that time, it was taught by someone from Europe, by an English architect by the name of Josiah Conder, and he essentially taught European architecture. Architecture was European architecture. He used English textbooks, essentially translated them. He talked about European architecture and specifically about the superiority of British architecture. Yes, if you're a young architect, student of architecture in Japan, what is your MA thesis about? What in the history of Japanese architecture could you possibly write about? Now, Ito Chuta he designed a building, and this is it. And this is, it strikes us as peculiar, right? It's a 13th century French, ecclesiastical building, a cathedral essentially, that he had never seen a building of that kind in his life. But in some ways, it's a very typical choice, right? Because architecture equals Western architecture, it was clear that you had to come up with such a building. But we can safely say that from that moment on, for the rest of his life, he struggled against this hegemony. And you could even say that you could summarize his life work as a protest against his own MA thesis. And in his PhD, he then addressed the building that we've already seen, the Horyuji in Nara. So for those of you who haven't been there, it is the oldest extant building in Japan. It is the oldest wooden building anywhere in the world. And of course, it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site too. And so he was the first Japanese architect ever to address a Japanese topic, to talk about a Japanese building. And he did this in his thesis. Now, this is the building as it looks like today. And he was particularly struck by, there are all kinds of features in his PhD thesis, but the main point that also produced and gained him fame was his thesis that the temple bore some similarities with ancient Greek architecture, in particular the main building. And so the way he describes this is that he says, if you enter the building, and this is also again from his notes, you can see that the columns have an entasis that is very Western. In other words, a sort of a curved, right? This curved feature, the perimeter decreases with height, and it is not only Western, but in some ways the whole building conserves various elements that are sort of part of Chinese tradition, Indian tradition, and a legacy of Greece. Now, at the beginning and in his PhD thesis, this is still an intuition, right? It's a thesis, but it's difficult to prove, right? Where did this actually come from? Now, the idea that he now proposes is this. He says this particular form was developed, yes, in Greece, right? And then it was Alexander the Great and his armies that traveled all the way into Asia and Central Asia, and that's where they brought Greek culture, including architecture. And then from this place, Gandhara over here, it then travels across the Silk Road into China, and then into Korea, and then sort of trickles down into Japan. And then you have the Horyuji, right? So how to prove that? Well, Ito's choice was very simple. He said, I'll do reverse engineering, right? I'll just travel back. Oh yeah, I should say one word about this influence, right? I mean, what is this influence about? Essentially, it's three things that are typically referred to. First is, allegedly, the Greeks brought stone architecture to Central Asia that hadn't been there. Second, this various architectural forms like the entasis that we've already encountered. And third, also the idea that you could represent, so the first Buddha statues in human form date back to the Gandhara, to the Greco-Bactrian kingdom. So this is the third element of this influence that is typically talked about. Now, what Ito did is he said, well, I'll pack my things and go, right? And I'll travel back the same path that this influence came. So through China and all the way back to Greece. Now, and this is his itinerary. It's not a great map, but it's probably you can still follow me, I think. So he starts in Tokyo and then travels via China, where he spends almost a year, into Burma, and then India, where he again spends 8 months. Travels through the Strait of Hormuz into the Ottoman Empire, spends another 8 months in the Ottoman Empire, Istanbul, but also other places. Now, how to do that? He asked the Ministry of Education, can you fund this? And this is if you're familiar with Japan in the 19th century, only to some extent, you'll realize that this is a highly unlikely trajectory. The Ministry of Education regularly sent young scholars to Europe, to Vienna, to Heidelberg, to Baltimore, but they would never send anyone to Asia, right? So they, at the beginning, refused, and it took him long negotiations to actually make his case. And they said, all right, we'll give you the money, provided that you'll, in the end, also briefly visit England and the United States. And he said, okay, I'll do that. So he had a brief stopover in these places before he came home. So this is, I mean, in the moment when Meiji Japan was all about the West, right, about learning from the West, quote unquote, Ito looked, at least, I mean, he wanted to travel through Asia to prove his point. He traveled to all kinds of places. He saw, the Forbidden City in Beijing. He saw Nestorian churches, Muslim, Buddhist and Muslim sanctuaries. He saw the Hagia Sophia and all that. But the most important, this is again from his field notes, he was very lonely apparently in between. The most important stop in his travels, 3-year-long travels, however, were the so-called Yungang grottos in the vicinity of, I mean, not very far from Beijing. This is a 5th, 6th century rock sculpture, so a place with rock sculptures, Buddhist rock sculptures, largely forgotten at the time, that he discovered, quote unquote, right? It's, again, now it is one of the 3 major sites of Buddhist sculpture in China, but it had fallen into oblivion largely over the centuries. And it was, and he was excited about this. It was not in his dreams, did he say. Was it, could I conceive such a thing, that I could actually stumble across a place like that? The sculptures of the Buddha were very similar, he writes, to the Buddha in the Horyuji. And at the same time, there were so many similarities with architectural forms in Greece. For him, the Yungang grottos proved that his theory of influence was correct, and the larger sort of intellectual world and larger public in Japan believed him, and his fame was linked to the thesis of the traveling Intasis ever since. Now, let's briefly turn to South Asia, where Rajendralal Mitra, a few years earlier than Ito, was also an aspiring architect and architectural historian. He started his life as a secretary and librarian for the Asiatic Society of Bengal, the famous institution of learning instituted by the British. It was in some ways a very imperial institution that was all about learning about the place that you want to rule. So it was a classical sort of power knowledge nexus here. And he started in a very sort of a subaltern position in this place, right, where everyone who had something to say in the Asiatic Society was British. But across his life, he became very influential, and finally, in the 1880s, he became the president of the Asiatic Society. So he became a very influential Bengali scholar and representative of the middle classes, of the rising middle classes. He was part of all kinds of, as you can imagine, clubs and associations to reform Bengal, and he earned the esteem of his British colleagues as well, even if that esteem was sometimes somewhat, let's call it, paternalizing, right? Like in this quote from Friedrich Müller, who's technically German, but I think for the purposes of our discussion, he's English now. Right, his English is remarkably clear and simple. Yeah, that's great. He has proved himself completely above the prejudices of his class, freed from the erroneous views on the history and literature of India in which every Brahmin is brought up. So the fact that he was not Indian makes him apparently worthy. Now, he was active in various fields. He was also a very political person. He was also a philologist. He edited volumes of ancient Indian literature. But he also worked in the field of architecture and produced, he was one of the first who actually surveyed ancient architecture and produced various volumes charting the early history of South Asian building and architecture. And while he did that, he became famous through a particular controversy he had with an English architect, or an English historian of architecture, namely James Ferguson. We've already encountered, I don't know if you recall, we've already encountered James Ferguson on one of the earlier slides. Ferguson was sort of the main point of reference for Ito Chuta's socialization, right? He was one of the main figures that people refer to when he wrote one of the standard textbooks of world architecture. Now, Mitra and Ferguson got into a real conflict. Mitra, and this conflict is all about Greece. Ferguson was convinced that everything that was valuable in South Asian architecture was essentially a product of its encounter with the Greeks. So according to him, it is undeniable that the art of sculpture, or certainly of good sculpture, appeared suddenly in India at the very time when the Greeks came, and that it deteriorated more and more the further it receded from the Greek age. The Indians first learned this art from the Greeks, period. Now, Mitra didn't like this, and he tried to prove, and this literally over thousands of pages to show and prove exactly that this is not the case. And he ridiculed Ferguson's claim by saying, well, Alexander, during his, 3-week stay in the Punjab, taught the Indians, right, the principles of architecture, okay, the plan of harnessing horses, writing, drama, astronomy, philosophy, and everything that converts a race of naked savages into civilized man. And it would be preposterous to suppose that he would not leave behind him a copy of old Homer for the edification of the Indians. Now, that is, of course, a little sarcastic, but he was very friendly, respectful. He respected Ferguson as the preeminent representative of British scholarship. But Ferguson didn't take it very well, and he retaliated, I guess that's really the term that we need to use, by producing a full volume, a whole book of refutation of Mitra's, right? And in this book, what you read is really a form of character assassination, right? It's dotted with, quotes like the plans that he uses are absolutely useless, it's unintelligible, misrepresenting, it's hideous, unsuitable. There's a want of method, a total want of power to discriminate styles. I need hardly say that there is not one word of truth in all these hallucinations which disfigure his pages. Now, I mean, it's clear we can see the hierarchies of the imperial situation at play. Now, we've now encountered the two protagonists, right, Ito and Mitra, and it's fair to say that in some ways they were very different. I mean, the agendas that they had looked very different, right? In some ways you could say that while Ito was all fascinated with the links and connections, he was obsessed even with the question of transfer, of interactions. Mitra was the reverse, right? I mean, he tried to show that at least parts of South Asia were essentially isolated. They were not influenced in any substantial way by Europe, but also by in fact, also by others. So in some ways, it looks as if their agenda is even the opposite of each other. But that's not really the case, because in many ways they share a lot. They share an overall. So the overall goal that they both share is to introduce their own architecture into the world history of architecture. In other words, they try to rewrite a Eurocentric history of art that was standard fare at that time, right? And the way they do it is by essentially arguing that the development of architecture is universal, right? That is the main claim that they both make and that they both share. They say, I mean, this is, first of all, yeah, I should briefly say, yes, Ferguson is one of the main main authors, dominant authors at the time. The other is Bannister Fletcher, whose textbook was even translated into Japanese at the time, and it's a very typical representative of the textbooks that are out there and that extol and reproduce this Eurocentric narrative. So, for example, in the tree of architecture that Fletcher has in this, you see that this is the tree that grows out of sort of antiquity, Greece and Rome, and then moves into the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. But then, of course, you also have Chinese architecture, right? Indian, but there's nothing that sort of connects this to anything, in the present, right? These are, well, that path, or what was the right term to say that? There's no organic connection, right? In fact, Fletcher called these styles, so at the beginning they weren't even there, right? It was a textbook on the history of architecture, but only Europe. But then later they were introduced, but essentially as an appendix. He called that chapter where he introduced non-Western styles, non-historical styles. So for both Mitra and for Ito, very expressly so, they said so, we want to show that our architecture is historical, is part of that same story, right? And the main argument that they make is a universalist one. They say the reason why we can actually prove that that makes it plausible that architecture in India, in Japan, and in the West are on the same level is because humans share essentially the same sense of beauty. So, for example, this is just one example. Mitra says a Phidias, the famous sculpture of Greece, and one of India would have produced the beau ideal of perfection in either country without borrowing from each other, owing to the fact of the human mind being the same everywhere. And there are various examples of these kinds of statements, right? All right, so this is their claim, this is their life work, and in some ways they were very successful. In both cases, they've elevated their local history, their local architecture to that level. But of course, you could immediately ask, so to legitimate anti-Eurocentrism through universalism is a very tricky business. In fact, if you're familiar with discussions in post-colonial studies, it's clear that typically universalism itself is seen as the fundament, as one of the fundamental features of a cosmology that produces Western imperialism, of the legitimating structures of colonialism, right? So to use universalism as a tool against empire could be seen as a self-goal. And in fact, we could say, yeah, that's, in some ways we could say, we would concur, it's actually quite plausible. So we could say, well, what they do here, is this not a, as Partha Chatterjee has called it, a derivative discourse. They use it as a tool against empire, but what they're actually doing is they reproduce the very structures, the very epistemological and theoretical structures of the discourse of empire in order to sort of mount a resistance against it, right? They're already captives of something that they want to fight through the very language that they're using. This would be the question. And we could say, yeah, and to some extent, that seems very obvious. First of all, for two reasons in particular. First, because they use a term that in itself is entirely novel to their own society, right? This is the term of architecture. Architecture, it does not exist both in the local Bangla and in the Japanese language. It's a term and a concept that needs to be invented. And both do. So both Mitra and Ito, they create this notion of architecture. They do this in various ways. They try to go back to sort of older texts and use them, but then Mitra realizes for some of these terms, he needs to sort of introduce also loan words. He wants to keep them, as he says, he wants to keep them to really to a minimum in order to make this as compatible as possible with sort of local tradition and philological precedent. And Ito agrees. So Ito says, well, the term architecture is untranslatable, essentially. It's essentially untranslatable into Japanese. Whatever we do, it remains something that doesn't link or sync but we still need to do it, right? We still need to do it, and he does. And he creates this term, kenchiku, which is the term, the modern term for architecture in Japanese, as it is in Chinese. So yes, first of all, I mean, the first point would be to say they operate with concepts and a conceptual apparatus that is already a form of import, right? So that actually looks like it's a borrowed discourse. And the second point is this idea of the universal standard, because as we've already seen, the universal standard is after all Greece, right? And could there be a more Eurocentric standard than Greece? That's actually hard to imagine, right? We know that Greece, this idea that Greek antiquity represents everything that is beautiful, is part and parcel of the self-understanding of Europe ever since the days of Winckelmann. And in Germany in particular, this has a very complicated but very important history. The idea of Greece was used also to differentiate German culture from the French, the shallow French, I should say, and was then later part and parcel institutionalized in the education system in very close proximity to the state, so it became a form of state ideology. But it was clearly not only a German term, right? It traveled, essentially percolated into pretty much every European culture, everywhere where Romanticism reached, so that someone like Shelley, for example, could say that we are all Greeks. Our laws, our literature, our religion, our arts, everything has their roots in Greece. So again, if there was ever a sort of a Eurocentric standard, then this is it. But I think it would be short-sighted and reductionist to say that this is merely an import, and this is only a copy, an imitation. In other words, it would be not enough intellectually to say that Mitra and Ito are just the parrots that speak the script of Winckelmann, right? And this for three reasons. Now, the first reason, the first sort of conundrum, so if it was that simple, then what about riddle number one, which is chronology? So if it is the case that the hegemonic European discourse is only echoed in Asia, why does it take a full 100 years or even more to arrive? Why is it that even, let's say, in the late 18th century, when British scholars and administrators come to India and bring these ideas, why doesn't it register? Why does it take 100 years? Why is it, for example, if we look at the late 18th century, that a scholar like William Hodges can still say and say that the Grecian architecture comprises all that is excellent in the art, I cannot help considering as a doctrine. Why should we admire Greece in an exclusive manner or be blind to the majesty, the boldness, the magnificence of the Egyptian, the Hindu, the Moorish, and the Gothic as wonders of architecture? So this is the late 18th century. This is the sort of, this is the discourse that accompanies the British East India Company, that's behind the Battle of Plassey, you could even say, right? So why does it take a full 100 years? I think this is the first riddle that we need to solve. The second would be, is Greece actually the West? Again, it seems so plausible, intuitively, immediately clear, but it's a retrospective truth. It's not something that was clear to contemporaries. At least not necessarily so. It was definitely not true for Winckelmann, right? For Winckelmann, his yearning for Greece was defined by his resistance to what he perceived as the West. So what these ideas generated in the backwaters of what was then Germany were definitely not, the civilized West. But it wasn't even the West for Mitra and Ito. Ito, for example, we already saw that the Ministry of Education didn't want to fund his trip because they said it's not a trip to the West. But for him, really, Greece was more for him, let's say Greece and Minor Asia Minor was the place from where important influences both reached Western Europe and reached South Asia or Central Asia. In other words, in some ways, Greece is a fountain of energy and inspiration, well, for Asia, but also for the West. It cannot just be equated with the West, right? It's a much more complicated story. Likewise for Mitra. For Mitra, the Greeks, I mean, this is a long story, but essentially what his theory is that it is essentially the Aryans that bring, the Greeks are the descendants of the Aryans. So in other words, the fact that we're now in India borrowing from, or looking at Greece just means that we look at our own ancestors in some ways. So it's not the West, right? So for both Ito and Mitra, Greece is not simply the West. The third conundrum, the third difficulty of this simple story of Western imperialism is the question of why Greece in the first place. Because if you look even at European discussions since the 18th century, it's clear that Greece was clearly not the only contender. During the Enlightenment time, people looked at various places. For example, Egypt, right? Egypt, for example, for the Freemasons, was one of the major, inspirational cultures. For some others, it was China. China, maybe not so much because the argument was that Europe derived from China, but China as a model for enlightened societies to develop. And then as we move into the early 19th century, there was also what is sometimes referred to as the Oriental Renaissance. That is the discovery of South Asia and the Asian roots of Western culture, right? So if you put yourself in the position of someone like Mitra and you read Friedrich Schlegel, who says that everything, yes, everything without exception, has its origin in India, the primary source of all intellectual development. In a word, the whole human culture is unquestionably to be found in the traditions of the East. If you read that, you can't take it for granted that you then go to Greece, right, as the point of origin. No. So, in other words, a simple story of this is the West and this is what everybody else needs to accept doesn't hold water. Now, this is not to say, obviously, that empire didn't play a role, that the imperial hierarchies were not powerful, right? In other words, it's not a big surprise that Ito and Mitra didn't look at Tiwanaku or Persepolis or Gyeongju or places like that, right? So yes, there is that story, but it's clearly not the only story. It's only part of the story. So we need to come up with a different answer, and an answer that is less about something that is simply transferred from Europe, but I'd say it is produced under global conditions in the very moment in which Mitra and Ito begin their intellectual journeys. Can I briefly ask in terms of time? 15 minutes. Okay, good. So this is going to be very schematic. But so my argument would be, it's no good to just look at the moment, at this place where something derives from, but rather we need to understand Ito and Mitra in their particular moment, both in their place and in the global context in which they operate. And we need to look at larger processes that have an impact on this situation. And this is, we would need a lot of time, and I'm sure those of you who know historians know that they write these long books about this. So if we have just for 15 minutes, it'll be exploratory. And I'll briefly refer to 4 larger processes that have an impact on the moment and also on the way in which they connect to Greece. And that is nation building, empire, economic integration, and science, these 4 fields I'll briefly talk about, right? So essentially the argument would be that it is that particular moment that creates the need, I would even call it, to invent Greece for their own purposes, right? So the first field would be nationalism. Yes, I think it's obvious both are nationalists in their own ways. They both try to show and prove that their own nation's architecture is as good as any other, right? So that makes them nationalists of sorts. Mitra, in particular, is also very visibly a nationalist in the sense that he's one of the founding members of the Indian National Congress, as it was founded in 1885, right? So yes, that is clearly there, but there's more to it. I would argue that the infatuation with Greece, the love affair with Greece, is in some ways a representative feature of nationalism in Japan and in India at the time. This is going to be much too short for this kind of argument, but Japan sort of sees itself as, there's this discourse about Japan being the Prussia of the East. There is definitely a link to Germany, right? In particular after the Prussian victory over France, they turned to Germany as a primary model. And in some ways you could argue, and Chris is here to hopefully corroborate what I'm saying, that Indian intellectuals also in the 1880s begin to look beyond the British Empire for other models. Japan being one of them, Germany clearly being one of them, also Russia. And that, in some ways, translates into a particular idea of, so in the Japanese case, that yes, we want to align with the West, we want to be like the West, but we don't want to import everything. Yes, fine, bring on the trains, right? Bring on the telegraphs, bring on the material dimensions of Western civilization, but we want to remain spiritually Japanese. This is this term wakon yosai. You have the same in Korean and Chinese and so forth. And also in the Indian case, there is a discourse about the cultural essence of one's own nation. Now this is the term, the spiritual domain, is again Partha Chatterjee's, but the idea that vis-a-vis the obvious sort of material superiority, that is technological, military, economic, Indian nationalism is defined on this spiritual level, is one that is sort of that has a certain traction in South Asia. So, in other words, there is this sense of a latecomer nationalism in both of these places that seems to link them to the kind of idealism that is also an ingredient of German nationalism. In that sense, the warm acceptance that this idea of Greece has in both these places, I think, can be easily explained. Second, both of these places also have a very peculiar and special relation to empire, to imperialism. Now, in both cases, both these architects argue against Eurocentrism, against sort of an imperialist discourse. Mitra, in particular, he says he wants to show that he wants to refute connections, right? He wants to show that development in India would have been the same. Now, one of the contexts in which he says that is a very specific one. It is now this is going to be a quick detour, it seems, but it's, we need to understand the very place specificity of what he's saying. He's writing at the time of the so-called Ilbert Bill. Now, this probably means not much to most of you, but it is maybe the most contested political issue in India in the 19th century. At least that's what Thomas Metcalfe says. It is a bill that foresees, as you can see, that Indian judges will have the power to rule over and decide over British subjects. And as you can imagine, there's a huge discussion about this. There's an uproar among essentially all the British subjects in India who cannot imagine that locals, have the power to, to have jurisdiction over them. Why? For example, because on their plantations, they treat local laborers in the way in which they like that, and they fear that Indian judges will not tolerate that, right? And in fact, someone like Mitra, whom we already know well, he's convinced that actually needs to stop. The British planters, he says, this is Mitra, in his angry voice, the country, he says, could not have a greater curse than the Anglo-Saxon planters, the greatest tyrants who've ever been permitted to fatten on the ruination of the inoffensive and helpless peasants, men whose like can be had only in the slave owners of Virginia, right? So it's high time that we actually have Indian judges to rule on that. Now, remember Ferguson, remember Mitra versus Ferguson. Now, Ferguson is the opposite. He was a planter himself. He had an indigo, had invested in an indigo plantation. And the whole conflict between Mitra and Ferguson is essentially about the Ilbert Bill. It's not even about architecture, as I made you believe earlier on. This is what Ferguson himself says. He says, There are not probably even a dozen people who care 2 straws about Indian architecture. I mean, he does care, right? He writes a whole book about it. But apart from him, there's hardly anyone. But the real point is the discussion on the Ilbert Bill. Now, the question as to whether the natives of India are to be treated as equal to Europeans in all respects. And why do I need to write a book about one Indian? Because if after reading the following pages, any European feels that he would like to be subjected to Mitra's jurisdiction in criminal cases, he must have a courage possessed by few. So in other words, if you follow me with my scholarly argument against Mitra, then this is the end of the Ilbert Bill right away. The same for Mitra, right? For Mitra too, to show that Orissa did not need Greece to build its own architecture was essentially the same as saying South Asia doesn't need Indian judges on our benches, right? This was the same argument. So in other words, this whole debate about architecture was a highly political, anti-imperial debate, right? Now, how does Ito factor in? Well, I don't think I'm spoiling anything by saying that Japan was about to build its own empire, right? So the position of Ito vis-a-vis empire was quite a different one. In other words, yes, we have sort of a global landscape of imperialism, but India and Japan are at very different places in this, right? So Ito operated in a situation in which Japan amassed a huge empire in Asia, and we could even say that his travels, they were in some ways part and parcel of this imperial expansion, right? He was not an outright imperialist, but he did, however, build the 2 major symbolic sites of Japanese imperialism, namely the Shinto shrine in Seoul and the Shinto shrine in Taipei, Taiwan. In other words, the major, and these are literally the first buildings that were taken down in 1945 when the Japanese left, because they symbolized the empire. In other words, yes, Ito is part of an imperial story too, but of course it's a very different one, right? So we have, to put this schematically, we have a global structure, but very different ways to actually operate within it and to sort of articulate their own claims and to use Greece for their own claims. Very briefly to the other 2 issues, I'll be very brief here on the last 2. Economy, there's an economic dimension to this story as well. There's lots of things that could be said about this, but it's clear that in some ways both Mitra and Ito, through the very academic work that they're doing, they invest the monuments that they're talking about, the objects that they actually look at, they invest them with not only meaning, but they evaluate them. In some ways, they give market meaning, market value. They add to the market value. Their writings add to the market value of these things that are done in South Asia frequently just loitered, stolen. In the Japanese case, they're typically sold. In fact, Ito's mentor himself, Okakura Tenshin, he becomes the first curator of the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, and he buys the very objects that Ito writes about. So some people cash in here, right? But more generally speaking, we could say that these works of art become, we could even say aesthetic beauty becomes a sort of currency. It becomes a sort of capital of these countries. In particular, for example, in the world exhibitions. In these world exhibitions, here you see the Court of Progress in the Japan-British exhibition. But of course, Japan is typically not in that wing, right? It's in the wing where they exhibit traditional artwork, traditional paintings, traditional handicraft, and so forth. And Japan is not only, to some extent, these exhibitions were there for exporting stuff, right? They were there to sell off. But there's more to it than that. They were there to gauge the civilizational level of particular countries. And in the Japanese case, that is done through art. Japan was art in the Olympic Games of the world exhibitions of the 19th century. So there's clearly an economic, sort of a market dimension, let's put it this way, to this as well. Fourth and lastly, science. The debate about architecture in both cases is linked to the hegemony of the natural sciences. And in that respect, it's also very peculiar. In other words, it is very historical. It is a very particular moment in which this makes sense, because both Ito and Mitra, they agree that we need to move from sort of a very subjective idea of what is nice and beautiful and so forth to almost a law to truth that stand up to the demands of the natural sciences. And the move that they make is to say we need to move away from texts and we need to move towards artifacts. We need to move away from philology, and it's only architecture that tells the real truth, right? Because of course you could say that that texts lie. This is Alexander Cunningham, who is sort of the first British architect. In other words, it's not Mitra himself, but this is very much sort of the discourse within which he also speaks. The discovery and publications of all the existing remains of architecture and sculpture would throw more light on the ancient history of India than the printing of all the rubbish contained in the 18 Puranas, sort of classical holy texts. And Ito very similarly says, well, documents lie. You know, in architecture you cannot make additions. Architecture exists as it is. This is it, right? There's no forging, there's no lying in architecture, but in documents, yes. Nothing speaks of the past as accurately as architecture. So the attempt to link the discussion on aesthetics to science and the unchanging idea, at least, of an unchanging truth is also peculiar to both of them. All right, I'll conclude, or rather I don't conclude, but I'll offer you a brief epilogue. And the epilogue is called From Greece to Asia, because as immutable, as timeless as the idea of Greece was portrayed and seemed, it lasted only a few years. It just took a few years, and the whole idea of Greece being the standard against which to measure beauty vanished almost completely, both in India and in Japan. In the Indian case, we see the move from Mitra to someone like Abanindranath Tagore, the nephew of the famous poet, who is invested in not universal beauty, but in the specificities of Indianness. Right? His images, his pictures are not about the imitation of nature, but about expressing the Indian soul, the Hindu soul, I probably should say. It's not about universal standards. In fact, he is adamantly against the idea of universal standards in art, in beauty, and so forth. But he wants to produce something that is grounded locally and has resonance in Asia. The various famous architectural historians at the time who accompany this move against imitating nature. If you want to just imitate nature, why don't you just put the thing right here? Why do you bother painting it, right? That is the case that he's making. Similarly, with Ito, after the First World War at the latest, he begins to shift. His travels through Asia to Greece were no longer sort of a means to an end, but rather the thing itself. He writes about Asian architecture. His own idea of the Horyuji changes. The Horyuji is no longer Greek, but it's the repository of various Asian cultures. Now, this whole shift, obviously, is part of a particular moment. And just for convenience sake, I'll say it's 1905. It's that 1905 moment when in India in particular, you see the protest against British imperialism materialize in the so-called Swadeshi movement. This is a boycott movement, a nationalist boycott movement that, by the way, also includes the boycott of Western art forms. It is the moment when this whole discourse of civilizational development moves from one civilization, and you have either less or more of it, to, oh yeah, there are various, to sort of a clash of civilizations model, you could say. It's that very moment when we see artists talk about less about reform, progress, but about the climate, about spirit and culture. It's the moment after the Russo-Japanese War as a shorthand, right? And even Ito, who we saw, bringing Greece, the light of Greece to Asia, he changes. He becomes infatuated with India. He writes an architectural history of India. And in 1934, he produces his masterwork, his most famous building ever, which you can still see in Tokyo today. And it doesn't look Greek. So what began as a pilgrimage to the Parthenon, you could say, ends in the 1930s with a homage to Asia and a refutation of the idea of this particular moment. I call it sort of the Victorian moment of universal internationalism.